I would like to thank the Needham Research Institute for hosting this event, Professor May, and for hosting me over the past couple of months as a, like you said, Professor May, a research fellow in a time that was not very simple, seeing that we couldn't be in our offices much of the time. I would like to thank the speakers very much to have for agreeing to produce papers, especially for this workshop. It was quite a task that I sent their way, and I very much appreciated the willingness to do so, and of course the moderators of the sessions who kindly agreed to engage in this discussion as well and read the papers and further help and expand our discussion. And finally, I would like to thank Maddalena Poli for the design of the posters for this event, and Flaminia Pisceda for helping manage the technical side with me right now. Thank you for managing the waiting room. I see that we are more or less stabilized. We still have people coming in. So, I would like to say a few words now, and if you don't mind, I will be reading them out, as they contain some of the citations, for example, that were sent to the speakers. The ultimate goal of this workshop was to contemplate together on the question of what is disability in ancient China. Disability, even in the modern world, or possibly even more so in the modern world, is a difficult term to define. So difficult that the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, signed 2007, does not include a definition of disability, neither does it include a definition of persons with disabilities as such. The preamble recognizes that, and I quote, "Disability is an evolving concept resulting from attitudinal and environmental barriers hindering the participation of persons with disabilities in society. Consequently, the notion of disability is not fixed and can alter depending on the prevailing environment from society to society." It continues to state that disability is not considered, for the sake of the convention, as a medical condition, but rather as a result of the interaction between negative attitudes or an unwelcoming environment with the condition of particular persons, end quote. This approach complies with the social model of disability, that is, the perception of disability not as an individual ailment, but rather as a social construct. The social model, albeit with variations, is currently the leading approach to disability in terms of both the academic research or academic debate around it and policymaking around the world, or most of it. Within the context of the academic debate, Leonard J. Davis defines disability as the missing term in the race, class, and gender triad. In his words, and I quote, "Just as the conceptualization of race, class, and gender shapes the lives of those who are not Black, poor, or female, so the concept of disability regulates the bodies of those who are normal. Therefore," argues Davis, "the first task at hand is to understand and theorize the discourse of disability, to see that the object of disability studies is not the person using the wheelchair or the deaf person, but the set of social, historical, economic, and cultural processes that regulate and control the way we think about and think through the body." As historians of disability, I would suggest we engage in the reversal of this process that underlies the social model and aim to shed a new light on a given society in view of its understanding of disability. Specifically to this workshop, it is hoped that aspects of early Chinese society can be re-examined and re-evaluated through the prism of early Chinese conceptualizations of ability and disability. Keeping in mind the difficulty of defining disability at large and adding to it the probable unsuitability of modern conceptualizations of disability for usage in the context of early and medieval Chinese history, we aimed at this workshop to suggest some possible answers to questions pertaining to different perceptions of disability in early and medieval Chinese history. For the sake of maintaining a unified methodology, it was suggested to speakers that they generally work with Professor Christian Leyes's methodological definition, which presents disability as containing the following: physical handicaps or mobility impairments, sensory impairment, visual or auditory, speech disorders, learning disorders or intellectual disabilities, mental conditions, and multiple impairments, which is often a combination of some of the above. With this as a general guidance, speakers were also encouraged to take the liberty, if needed, to expand on these categories. So since our very aim is to define what comprised of disability in early and medieval China, it is possible, or more than possible, that we discover that our own definition of disability within the Chinese context differs to these before it. It is worth noting, however, that after much deliberation, it was decided that the workshop will focus solely on physical and mental impairments and will not include traits that might be considered disabilities purely as a product of social prejudice. So race, gender, etc., was not taken to be a disability for the sake of this workshop. Speakers were further encouraged to take into account some or all of the following. And these are several aspects that were suggested to them. The medical aspects is the condition or conditions you're looking into. Are they addressed in medical texts? Is it considered a disease? Is it considered curable or reversible? And are there any cases of healing? Social aspects, in which ways, if any, did society stigmatize the condition or conditions in question? Do you think it was indeed socially perceived as a disabling trait? Legal aspects, were there any legal restrictions or remedies that were put in place that addressed the condition or conditions under question? And of course, Professor Yates will later today give a talk that is wholly dedicated to the legal aspects of disability in early China. Vocabulary, which vocabulary is used to denote the condition or conditions that you're examining? Do you think there was an umbrella term for or similar to disability in early and medieval China? And this will have Professor Pittner talk about the terminology or the idea of disability as a term. And lastly, office holding and work are persons who have the condition or conditions in question mentioned as working in specific types of jobs. Were they employable? Were they recruitable for military service? And so on and so forth. With these common guidelines, we embarked on the task of composing our prospective papers. So as for the structure of this workshop, some of you may have noticed already that there is a certain thematic division to the sessions in this workshop. The first session today, which it will be today in about an hour from now, includes approaches to disability at large, or in the case of Dr. Chapman's talk, to a group of impairments. So larger questions, overarching questions. Session 2 and 3 then contain talks that deal with more specific impairments or disabilities, which are discussed individually in detail. In turn, these can generally be divided into physical impairments in session 2, although a question will be raised as for whether deafness was considered a physical impairment or an intellectual one, and then intellectual and mental impairments in session 3. Finally, in the roundtable session, which will be on Wednesday, we will gather to ask questions that linger from the juxtaposition of the talks and try to begin a discussion towards the understanding of disability in pre-modern Chinese history. This roundtable will be hosted by Professor Christian Leyes, editor of the volume Disability in Antiquity, who has kindly agreed to lead the discussion and share from his own experience with us. So before we begin, I would like to extend an apology to the medievalists among us in the audience. While every intention was to have a workshop that focuses on both early and medieval China, the papers ended up shifting towards the early periods rather than the medieval period. Nevertheless, questions and suggestions pertaining to the medieval period are warmly welcome in the discussion sections, and I'm more than curious to see what happens when we start opening these kind of questions. So this is just a heads up and an apology. Similarly, not much will be said in this workshop by way of comparison with other early cultures, although some comparative accounts will hopefully be included in the edited volume that we hope will ensue from this workshop. So we turn now, or very soon, to the keynote speech without holding you much further. Please note that at the end of the keynote speech, there will be some time for questions, if you will. And we will then go on a break where you're all welcome to stay logged in and either utilize the chat room or utilize Zoom to talk with each other. It might be a bit difficult with the numbers here, but suit yourself. Grab a drink, grab something to eat. And our first session will then begin at 4:10 British Standard Time, which is just under an hour from now, so 54 minutes from now. And for now, let us begin. And I am delighted to present the keynote speaker of this event, Professor Roel Sterckx. So Professor Sterckx is the Joseph Needham Professor of Chinese History, Science and Civilization in Cambridge University and a Fellow of Clare College. And as of 2013, an elected Fellow of the British Academy. Since graduating his PhD from the University of Cambridge, Professor Sterckx held positions in the University of Oxford, University of Arizona, and since 2002, the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Cambridge. Professor Sterckx's research focuses on the cultural history, religion, and thought of pre-imperial and imperial China, the classical and literary Chinese language, philology, text and manuscript studies, with an ongoing interest in forms of knowledge about the natural world. He has published 6 monographs and edited volumes, am I correct? That were translated in turn into different languages, as well as many articles. And amongst his recent publications are the 2011 monograph, Food, Sagehood and Sacrifice in Early China at Cambridge University Press, which I believe is very relevant to some of the discussions in this workshop. Also a fascinating edited volume on animals through Chinese history, earliest times through 1911, also at CUP, and recently a book for the general public titled, in the UK, titled Chinese Thought from Confucius to Kukding, which I warmly recommend if you have any acquaintances that would like to know more about Chinese thought. It's a wonderful book. His talk today is titled Sensory Ability, Inability and Disability in Early China, Some Questions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Roel Sterckx.
Thank you very much, Avital. There we are, and well, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, and thank you very much, for being here today. Let me start too by thanking Avital really for putting this workshop together in extraordinary times. I wish we could have all of you here in Cambridge, especially on a day like today when the sun is shining and the daffodils are smiling, but we will have to do that a different time. Now, I'm very grateful and very honored to be asked by Avital to say a few words here to get the body of the workshop started here. I have not done any in-depth research on the subject of disability. So what I'll offer here is a keynote, but that will not offer you the key to the subject, but give you some reflections, some thoughts that I have read through the papers, and as I went back to some of the issues that I've also been prompted to think about. I have for a while now been interested in where Chinese philosophers get their images and their metaphors from. So my assumption is that for an image or an analogy or a metaphor to be functional, let alone powerful, it needs to be shared. It needs to be recognized by an audience or a readership. And that means that when scholars of Chinese thought insist that their focus is on the world of ideas, this is to some extent a get-out clause for not having to try and link ideas to social practice, of course. Now, one of the images that has fascinated me is this recurring characterization in early Chinese texts of sages, of good rulers, of politically astute people as individuals who operate on a different sensorial plane. And by this, I do not mean, the usual physical deformities that feature in myth or in the hagiography of famous figures, right? They'll all be familiar to you. Zhang Jie having 4 eyes, or Yu the Great having 3 oral cavities, or Shun having double pupils, or Lao Dan having long ears, right? Or Confucius having a protruded forehead. No, I have in mind an image that will be familiar to you, namely sages, good rulers, and intelligent folk hear without listening. They see things without looking. They taste the essence of things without sampling. They feel something without the need to touch. So for sages and people with superior comprehension of the world, disabled senses result not from a malfunctioning of the sense organs, but instead from overexposing the senses. And so they plug up their ears, they have pearl beads draped in front of the eye line, they hide behind screens or walls, or they hide deep away in palaces. They communicate by not speaking, they taste what is tasteless, and so on and so on. And as you know, there are plenty of such descriptions in the text of the period. I'll just pull up a couple of examples. Here are just 2 extracts from the Lao Tzu commentaries in the Han Feizi. One is from the Jie Lao and the other one from the Yu Lao chapters. And in this first passage, the emphasis is on overexposure. And in the second passage, the sensory organs are seen as channels through which vital energies can drain if the body is not maintained properly. So just have a look at it. So human beings rely on the sort of tinming, right? They get their perspicacity, their potential to see something from heaven, right? Same with tiancong, with their acuity, and even with their kind of knowledge function, their tianzhi. But if they look, or if their vision is too strong, so if they see too much, the eyes won't be ming, right, clairvoyant. If they hear too much, their ears won't be sharp. And the passage goes on. I believe Avital in her paper, might return to this one at greater length. The second passage, of course, is even clearer, right? So you have holes and cavities in the bodies, and they are like the huyo, they're like the doors and the windows, of the spirit, right? And if you don't guard this, then obviously your energies will be drained, and in the end, you lose your zhu at the center, right? You need a channel, you need a sort of you need a master at the center of the body who can channel that energy in the correct proportions. Now, the idea that efficient rulership depends on the capability of a ruler to turn his senses inwardly is certainly not a theme that is limited to proto-Taoist texts, if you like. There's a nice example of Li Si in his biography in the Shi Ji, right, where he describes the hallmark of the monarch, which of course in his case is the quote-unquote legalist ruler, as somebody who stops the avenues of hearing and sight, somebody who sees and hears inwardly. And if he does that, then from without, he can't be moved by the deeds of humane and righteous men. And from within, he can't be carried away by arguments, by remonstrance. And therefore, Li Si says, He is able to act according to his heart's content. And of course, importantly, no one dares to oppose him. So this is a kind of sort of politically or social strategy, right? Shutting off the senses. Now, when we speak about the senses, or sensory ability, or sensory impairment, we are, of course, forced to define such states of being as each other's inverse, or complementary opposites, if you like. In other words, disability or impairment are measured against ability or capability. And what is interesting is that as soon as we move out of the medical or the physiological context, the very same impairments that disable and disconnect somebody from normal society can function for others as the hallmark of advanced perception, of knowledge, and of insight. And a variation on this theme is the idea that the loss of one sense organ results in the overcompensation of another. And the latter, of course, is illustrated, by the figure, of the blind musician that several amongst you, will have mentioned or will mention in your papers. The blind musician whose disability casts him into the role of advisor and trusted confidant of the powerful. Now, when I looked into some of these narratives of the blind musician a while ago, about 10 years ago, I looked at these stories primarily in the context of understanding of the body, of understanding of the senses, in the context of idealized physiologies of human emotion. But what I should have seen, or what I should have emphasized, is that the narratives on the blind musician, or indeed other disabled or deformed figures, are often best read in the arena of political discourse. An apparent physical handicap does not prevent someone from being able to see or diagnose the deep structures of society and expose their rulers' shortcomings. The message is that the senses delude as much as they reveal. When the blind advise the short-sighted, and when introspection becomes superior to optic vision, when blindness literally delivers insight, one then wonders what attitudes towards disability underlie the society that inspires these metaphors and these analogies. What or who were these authors looking at, and how much documented evidence is there to suggest that philosophers did not simply pluck their vocabulary and their analogies out of their creative imagination? Now, there obviously is plenty of evidence in the sources, and the papers in this workshop will examine this evidence in detail across various textual genres. However, when we come to the subject of disability in early Chinese sources, we should probably also acknowledge that we have arrived, it seems to me, in very complex territory. First, leaving aside the question of how disability or impairment or infirmity should be defined, right? Whether you want to give it a social, a legal, an economic, a biophysical definition. Irrespective of these definitions, what underlies all attestations of disability is the notion that someone, somehow, somewhere, sometime deviates from the norm, or perhaps better, a norm. And of course, when something deviates from the norm, it is deemed noteworthy, and therefore it ends up in our sources. Right? Just to paraphrase a standard line in the Kungyang Zhuan, right? Why is this thing recorded in the sources? The answer is always because it is strange. So it is the anomaly that tends to be the subject of discussion. Right? The monster, so to speak, is there to reveal or show a deeper truth, right? As in Latin monstrare. By contrast, what is normative is often left implicit. It seems as if descriptions of the perfectly balanced body are harder to come by than those that are defective or stand out in other ways. Now here on the slide, you have one that I pulled up from Wang Fu's Xian Fo Lun, right, sort of Eastern Han, who describes the ideal bodily qualities desired by the physiognomer as follows here, right? So you want the face to be, you want breadth, you want symmetry, you want smoothness, you want vibrancy. The hands and feet should be long, slender, wide, straight. Your pace, your gait, of course, should be easy and secure. The voice should be mild, harmonious, preferably of middle range. Head, face, hands, feet, figure, bones, and so on should all complement each other's. And these are the sort of essentials the physiognomer should be looking out for. Now, of course, you turn Wang's list upside down and you will have most of the characters we will meet in the papers ahead, from the crippled amputee to the mute hunchback. In short, it will be clear to any reader of early Chinese texts, be these philosophical, biographical, or administrative sources, that imperfection, impairment, or simply physical anomaly gets and is noted. Now, the question we should ask, therefore, is then not only what did the ancient or medieval Chinese understand by disability, but what motivates an author or a text to make it noteworthy and to refer to it in a specific context. The blind musician shows up for a reason, and the lands of double-eyed or one-legged people, or indeed, as we will learn, of dwarfs, these lands are situated in the periphery for a reason. Of course, at least if their mention has any value in establishing norms or normality for a civilizing center. When the disabled rank alongside other hybrids and freaks in the natural world that signal a judgment on human affairs, these appearances, of course, require explanation. Not so much because the disability itself needs explaining, but because a judgment needs to be made whether this disability is significantly ominous or whether it can be ignored. Now, despite idealized descriptions, of course, as we have many in our text, virtuous rulers who assist the hungry, who assist the orphans, the ill, and the disabled, there can, of course, be little doubt that to suffer a disability of any kind in early China, either congenitally or one that's externally inflicted, was a hard and unpleasant predicament. There was, of course, the physical and mental trauma, but perhaps even more pronounced in our sources, the sort of social exclusion. And of course, let's not forget, ancient China is not unique in this respect. But in a world in which so much emphasis was put on ethical and physiological self-cultivation, a world in which perfection, balance, proportion, and harmony are the calling cards in nearly every aspect of life, from the culinary to the medical, to the political, from the world of human mortals to the spirit world. In such a world, imperfection must have stood out, and it had to be explained. And these explanations, of course, could be ethical, or physiological, or psychological, or even geographical. They could draw on the cosmos and the constellations, and they could require the predictive reading and interpretation by a diviner or a physiognomist. Or indeed, as we will learn, they warranted a legal or an administrative taxonomy, just as the law had defined the legal meaning of a wound, or the symptoms of leprosy. Right? For the law being too short to serve in battle constitutes a disability. For the diviner, sprouting a growth that resembles horns is a sign of a battle to come. Now there is another complexity. Whether our sources are prescriptive or descriptive, in many cases, we cannot take their description of the infirm at face value. Often, they are part, or these descriptions rather, are part of a narrative. They serve as a rhetorical tool, or they function as biographical or historiographical ploy. So there are therefore limits to what can be achieved by sifting out or distilling references or key terms denoting various forms of disability across the entire textual corpus of earlier medieval China and analyzing them as timeless or sort of a placeless phenomenon. The fact that lexicons themselves tend to regionalize some of the vocabulary that refers, to certain conditions is already a sign of this. Generic illness or disease vocabulary in early Chinese is as complex as it remains in most languages today. And even when we try and identify certain terms through our lexicons, it is not always clear whether the explanation we get is one of the graph or the character that represents a certain condition, or whether we are presented, with the etiology or the biophysical explanation of the condition itself. Now, we also need to read across the genres. And when it comes to tales of the impaired, of the deformed, or the sensorially extraordinary individual, or the amputee, the Zhuangzi, of course, and its cognates, the Huainanzi, or for later times the Liezi, they tend to be our favorite fodder. Right? Behind Zhuangzi's cripples and amputees lurks a world in which everyone and everything should aspire to be wholesome, complete, intact. Juan, right, it's the character which I've stuck on this slide of the Needham Institute, right? We enter the Institute thinking that we are Chen, and after years of research, we all crumble into pieces usually and discover, that there's more to it. Anyway, Chen is also an ideal of the cultivated ruler in many other Warring States texts. But Zhuangzi's genuine person is not bothered by infirmity, since, of course, he operates in a world beyond normal sensory perception. He does not look at the body as whole or intact because it is composed out of perfect or integral constituent parts. No, the point is precisely that there is nothing but wholeness. And yet, as work by colleagues such as Albert Galvani or Romain Graziani has shown, if we simply read Zhuangzi imagery as an inversion of classicist / confusion, idealized narratives on bodily perfection, right, as a criticism or a commentary on filial piety, if you like, we do miss out on social history. We do miss out on the dynamics of inclusion or exclusion of all the maimed and disabled that must have been witnessed by writers of his time. We then focus on the disability while we forget that these figures, of course, act as intermediaries, as entertainers, as gatekeepers, as diviners, and so on. And we overlook that being wholesome or Quan is a language, is a vocabulary that, for instance, also shows up in legal texts. Now, there are indeed, and just to borrow the title of the workshop, there are many other bodies. And one important one is, of course, also the body politic. For if the state is to function as a balanced body, with the ruler at its head, and ministers acting as the limbs, then, of course, a crack or fissure in this cosmic body is surely significant. It is at the edges of the cosmic body or the body politic, that the regular order of limbs and organs expires. It's the soil one lives on, its climate, the air one breathes, the food one eats that shape the body and its functioning. And here then, we are dealing with a taxonomy of civilization, not of physicality. And here, human disability compares to the condition of the non-human species. Origin narratives seem to skip over disability or physical exclusion in their diachronic description of humanity from a golden age to a troubled present. Or to be more precise, disability comes in at the end, after the wild animal stage and just before the collapse of civilization. So our folk who behave like beasts, or feed like them, or clothe themselves in hides, disabled, uncivilized, are both. Now, early Chinese thinkers, that's at least an impression that I have, seem to prefer to speak either about what is wholesome, Chen, right, either physically or ethically and so on, or about what is shapeless and formless, denouncing what is partly shaped or deformed. And I have wondered how they perceived the distinction between visible deformity and invisible disability, right? Blindness, deafness, or sense, an impairment of the senses. And I've wondered also, and I don't have an answer to this, why our sources are so modest in describing tactile experience. Now, finally, disability, it seems to me, also operates as a function of role consciousness. Here then we arrive at the issue of congenital versus socially inflicted disability, right? The story of the battle wound, legal mutilation, accidents, eunuchs, and so on. But more importantly, we here arrive at the issue of strategic disability or strategic illness, or what Lawrence Schneider calls the madman of choose, tactical madness. Now, that the madman has become such a trope in Chinese literature may not be unique to China, but the reasons behind this may require further thought. The madman sits somewhere in between the visible and invisible. He, and on most occasions, at least in the early period, it seems to be a he. So he can be physically distinct, right? He even can have demonic appearance, right? He can have his hair disheveled, slurred speech, right? Sores inflicted by lacquer, as we learn. He can be shabbily dressed, even naked. Or the madman can simply display odd behavior or utter opaque language. Or he both shows and things beyond the norm. Yet, as difficult as it is to define, madness often appears in early Chinese texts as a deliberate strategy. Claiming malfunctioning health, right, doing a sickie if you like, or pretending to be mad was one among few strategies that people had available to negotiate severance from their obligations to a ruler, or a way to escape one's enemies. It was a way to sever oneself from the body politic, to circumvent the perception or accusation that one was rebellious, disloyal. Now, Christian Schwermann, right, in his book on Dummheit, on madness in early China, he has shown that to pretend insanity was not simply a form of passive protest, but rather a strategy of survival that was gradually transfigured into an ideal of resistance. And that brings us to the many occasions when claiming disability or masquerading as mad was a ploy to disable oneself from social obligations, such as conscription or taxation. And this is a fate, so it seems, that even befell our philosophers, who, after all, like to present themselves as unrecognized sages. Right? As the Xunzi states, right? Xunzi cherished in his heart the mind of a great sage, but it had to be concealed under the pretense of madness, and it had to be presented to the world as stupidity. Now, in another story, and that's a story that appears in multiple versions, we have a family in the state of Song that had been unremitting in its virtuous conduct for generations. And one day, it is confronted, wugu, without any particular reason, with this odd sight of a black cow that gave birth to a white calf. So they consult Confucius. And Confucius, against their expectation, thinks that this is a good omen, and he tells them to sacrifice the calf to the spirits. The family does so, and as a result, the father of the family turns blind 1 year later. Now, when this cow gives birth to another white calf, and when Confucius is again consulted by the son of the family, he again calls for the calf to be sacrificed. And this time, as a result, the son too loses his eyesight, wugu, for no obvious reason. In the end, Confucius' persistence is vindicated when the city of Song comes under siege by Chu, and all able-bodied men are called to its defense. Being crippled and useless in battle, of course, both father and son managed to escape the fighting. Their blindness had saved them, and after the siege, they miraculously regained their eyesight. So here then we are back, to the virtues of the blind and to Confucius, who is able to see beyond what appears anomalous at first sight. But what we tend to forget is that behind such stories, there must lurk a social history, one in which claiming insanity, claiming disability, or claiming illness offered ways around conventional norms. To some, it really paid off to be abnormal. Good. There is a saying in the Zhuochuan, Duke C24, for the favorites amongst you, that when you wash your hair, your mind turns upside down. And when your mind is upside down, your thinking is backwards. I have, in these 20 minutes, been thinking backwards and forwards at the same time, which is a sign that I probably, should stop here. And I very much look forward, to learning more, from the scholars gathered here who have obviously researched the subject at great length. So thank you all, for your attention, and enjoy the workshop.
Thank you very, very much, Roel, for this. And we do have time for 1 or 2 questions, if you're happy with this, Roel.
Sure, if there are.
Great. So if we have any questions, please, if you could type down in the chat the word question, or if you would not like to read it yourself, please feel free to type down your question itself, and we will read it out for you. So let's just see if there are any questions on these. My question, if possible, is I was wondering, because I will talk about it a little bit tomorrow, but it does seem like a bit of a privilege of the sages to block their own senses. So to which extent do you think that we are able to relate this with a disability? To which extent do you think even it was related in their minds to these actual disabilities? You did say that it may have been an embellishment of the philosophers. So what do you make of this?
Well, thank you. Well, this is the problem that we have in my sort of understanding of of the sources, is that we have this narrative in quote unquote philosophical text, which of course to a large extent is metaphorical, right? It is imagery, it is figurative language. It consists of analogies and so on and so on. But these analogies and this figurative language operates in a society in which people must recognize what it is that they're trying to say. And that doesn't mean, of course, that these particular writers or the writers behind these texts were inspired by a particular side of, certain types of disability. But there must be reasons why it is that they're focusing on particular figures. Right? There must be reasons why the madmen in the Zhuangzi or the amputees in the Zhuangzi, of course, are gatekeepers. Right? We can relate this, of course, to a criticism of Confucian views of whatever bodily integrity and so on and so on. But there are lots of snippets of social history through this, and the idea that sometimes it is good not to be overexposed, to the world around you, which is, of course, the standard narrative we have with sages, and of course we have with rulers and people who have to understand, the deeper essence of the world. Again, it's imagery that operates in the context, of what must have been, relevant. And so I don't know exactly, and there is obviously no way, to match quote unquote social history, to this imagery, but it is imagery that's not there, in a void. And so I would love, to learn more about how we bridge that, right? Rather than zooming only in the specific genres of text and saying, well, this is the disabled, these are the disabled in legal text, these are the disabled in Zhuangzi, these are the disabled in the context, of correlative cosmology and so on. It seems to me that in early Chinese society, perhaps, wasn't as compartmentalized as we would like it to be. But it's a question, it's not an answer to a question.
Of course, and I think one of the biggest challenges to all of us was exactly this: where does the history in the text end, and what can we actually say about what happened in reality? We have a couple of questions. I see 3, even 4 questions, but I will try to ask as many as possible before we have to go on the break. So Marjing asks, you've touched on that a bit, but could you say a few more words on how you think, or how we should think about the connection between the history of the saints and the social history of the underclass in terms of disabilities impact? And I think you've answered some of this now. So if you have anything to add to this.
I don't like to use the category the saints or the sages versus the common people, because that to me seems a bit too simplistic a way of looking at that society. I would be much more in favor of in a way mixing up our sources a little bit, and not always just sort of limit our gaze or have our gaze determined by the specific genre of a text that we're reading, but see whether we see conceptual parallels, between them, right? And so, I mean, the clearest example, but of course, Professor Yates, will talk to us about that in greater detail. The clearest example is you can't really read a lot of the philosophers in their mention of whatever amputees and handicaps, and without actually looking at some of the legal background and some of the terminology that you find in there. So I prefer to use the word common in a different way. For me, common in early China means something that is common to all the strata of society that we're able to sort of form a view on. And very often it seems to me that that there are many more kind of commonalities, than elements that separate whatever the sages from the common people.
Lovely, thank you very much. I think we will ask one more question, which is Ken Brashier's question. Ken, would you like to ask your question yourself, or would you like me to read it out?
Either way, actually, Rule, I was just going to ask, when we talk about abnormalities, physical or mental or otherwise, drawing on your own expertise of the animal world, that is the non-human animal world, do we ever talk about trend wholeness versus impairment, positive, otherwise, when we think about when we think about non-human animals, and is this a useful way of thinking about the category?
Thank you, Ken, and good to see you after all these years. I have the impression less, that this trend, doesn't appear as much as in the sphere of the of the non-animal world, so to speak. However, of course, as many of you will know better than me, you have plenty of descriptions, of course, to these hybrids that have multiple limbs or that don't look normal, and it's their abnormality that makes them somehow special. So it seems to me that the imagery, the metaphor, the analogies sometimes stretches across the boundary of whether somebody is human or non-human.
Well, I was thinking about the wholeness of sacrificial animals, for example.
Yeah. And then the cascading, of course, the cascading order in which you divide the trend, right? The whole carcass of the animal, and you use, the whole carcass of the animal, the whole offering, of course, and is the privilege, of for certain sacrifices and taking the first cut and the first division and so on and so on. But I don't necessarily see that's the wholeness, but it's the I suspect that trend, refers to more than simply physical, physical wholesomeness. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, if you extend this to the sphere of sacrificial religion, then of course the whole and the part, form a very important, notion. That's right.
And of course, the impaired were not allowed to make those sacrifices as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think Tulika Sinj, I do see your question here. I'll just read it out loud because I think this question will have to save for later, perhaps for Professor Pittner's talk. And the question is, Professor Sterckx, I'm curious to know, is there any term for disability in early Chinese sources? And as we would say, you can write a paper about it, maybe even more than a paper. So I do think that with your permission, we will skip this question for now, but keep it in mind if this is all right with you, Professor Sterckx. And thank you very, very much again for joining us from different sides of the world.